Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I want to thank Lisa and Lucas for graciously inviting me to come and speak to you about a topic that I'm very passionate about, and that professionally it is the primary focus of my work. And I'm particularly delighted to be at Marquette University, given sort of the important role that Jesuit institutions have played in terms of providing access to higher education. So I'll share with you in particular some of the highlights or some of the important, what I see, contributions of Jesuit institutions to this issue of access for undocumented students and students from immigrant communities. But before I get into the details of my work and sort of highlighting why I think it's important for all of us to work together to find solutions that will provide a better quality of life for immigrant families and for Latino families here in the U.S., I want to start by sharing with you my own immigrant story, my journey from El Salvador to the U.S. So over 30 years ago now, in the late 1970s and 1980s, my family migrated to the U.S. And we did it in a way that's very typical of immigrant families today. That most of us, who don't come from an immigrant background, don't always sort of realize that that's the process. We tend to think of immigrant families moving together all at once as a group. But the reality for immigrant families, particularly from Latin America, is that they do that through a step process. And for our family, my father was the first one to come. And this was at the outbreak of the Civil War that started in the late 1970s and went on to most of the 80s. And so it was, we were escaping, armed conflict. And for refugees and political asylum seekers from Central America, from Guatemala and Nicaragua, where there was also armed conflict that eventually developed into, civil war, there was no option to enter the United States through political asylum or refugee status. The U.S. government did not recognize those conflicts as ones that would qualify immigrants from that region of the world to come under those conditions. And so we did what immigrants do in that situation when they see very little option to remain in a place where your life is always in danger. So my father came and he worked multiple jobs so that he could send for my mother, who 2 years later joined him. At the time, so we were separated from my father for 2 years. 2 years later, we were separated from my mother, and so we stayed behind with our grandparents. And so my paternal grandmother became like a second mother to me. And up until the day that she died, she was mom, and I didn't see a distinction between, my biological mom and my grandmother just because of that bond that developed while they took care of us. So when my mother arrived here, she also did what my father had been doing for 2 years and worked multiple jobs in the low-wage sector to be able to save enough money to send for my sister and I. And so in 1984, when I was 10 years old and my sister was 8 years old, my parents had finally saved up enough money to pay for our journey to the United States. And so we embarked on that journey with my grandfather, who came as a chaperone. We couldn't make the trip on our own, obviously. And so we took a plane from San Salvador to Tegucigalpa, Honduras. And from Tegucigalpa, we flew to Mexico City. And from Mexico City, we flew to Tijuana, Mexico, close to the U.S.-Mexico border, close to the San Isidro crossing border, which is the busiest crossing border in the world. And when we arrived, we received, we were questioned by the Mexican authorities. They knew that many Central American migrants were flying to Tijuana because that's where they crossed the border. That's where the journey to the other side began. And so, we were harassed, and we were prepared for that. So we paid them. We came already with bribe money so that they would leave us alone. And so we paid them. They let us go, and we headed to a hotel that we were instructed to spend the night there, and at 4 in the morning be ready for someone to pick you up. So that's what we did, and they said, leave everything behind. Whatever luggage you bring, just leave it. Just bring whatever you're wearing. So at 4 in the morning, we leave the room. We leave all our belongings that we had on our trip there. My grandfather, by the way, was 52 years old at the time when we made the journey. And a car comes up and picks us up. It's still dark. The sun hasn't come up. And, we drive for a while. And we get to this agricultural area. And then eventually we arrive at a greenhouse. And we're told to wait there, and somebody else is going to pick us up. And for what seemed like an eternity, eventually somebody showed up just as the sun was coming up. And they drove us another distance. And finally, the driver pulled over and said, okay, now the three of you need to get into the trunk of the car. We're about to cross the border. And you can't make a sound because you will be discovered and you'll be sent back to your country. And, he was very serious about that. And, we're little kids. We didn't really know what that meant. Of course, when, he actually closed the trunk and it was dark, my little sister did what any child under those circumstances would do, is she panicked and started crying. And so we were driving to the border, and during that drive, my grandfather, did whatever he could to try to convince her to not cry, because we were going to see our parents soon, and that it was going to get us in trouble. Eventually it started to get really hot, so hot in fact that I think we just passed out from the heat. I mean, I remember just being insufferable and then just falling asleep. And that's the last thing I remember until somebody opened up the trunk and said, we're here. We made it to the other side. Are you guys hungry? So at this point, we were in it looked like a junkyard. I remember seeing a lot of car parts and cars with missing doors and all kinds of things. And our first meal in the U.S. Was a plate of tacos, which we didn't know what that was. And he said, do you want tacos? We didn't know what that was, but we were hungry, so we ate them. And so he said, now we're going to drive you to Santa Ana, California, which is just outside of L.A., where your parents will be there to wait for you. And so, we talk about the American dream. For me and for my sister, the American dream began when we crossed the border in the trunk of a car. And from that moment, much of our family experience maps onto many of the families that we continue to, work to support. I remember part of my childhood experience was worrying about deportation and worrying about running into the authorities, and hearing stories about friends and distant relatives and co-workers who would get, they'd show up for work and there was a raid and people were taken away and they were sent back and families separated. I mean, that was a regular occurrence, and there was sort of this ongoing concern. And my father, I remember very intently always listening to the radio to hear the most recent news about where the raids were happening and if it was going to happen somewhere near where they worked. And that was it. And that was just the fact of life every day. We always worried anytime we saw a police cruiser. We get this physical reaction of anxiety, hoping that, we don't get noticed, that, my father would tense up, and just focus on not doing anything that, would get him pulled over. Avoiding any kind of government agency because you don't know what they're going to do. Now, I wouldn't be here standing in front of you as a Stanford-educated university professor and researcher if not for a singular important event in my family's life. And that was the passage of the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, also known as IRCA. So I am here because of IRCA. But what's really interesting about IRCA is that we almost missed that boat, or we missed that boat for a very long time, because like many immigrant families, we were very skeptical of IRCA. We were very skeptical when the news came out and said, wait a minute, you're telling me that we're supposed to walk into an immigration office, fill out this paperwork, hand them a payment, and then we're going to get legal status, and that's not a ruse to just round up people as soon as they come up? I mean, that was the concern. So as soon as IRCA passed, first year, second year, going into the third year, we still hadn't applied because we thought, we're not going to take a chance. And we had heard stories, we started to hear stories about people that said, it's okay, we went through it and it's legitimate, it's not a ruse. But my family still was unconvinced, my father was unconvinced. And one day, he's driving to work 4 in the morning and he's listening to the Spanish language news, and there's an announcement by a representative of an organization called CHIRLA, which is an immigrants' rights organization in Los Angeles. It played a pivotal role in advocating and lobbying for the passage of IRCA. And so IRCA, realized that there was this great amount of people that still had not benefited from IRCA. And so here we finally got a law in place, but people don't want to come in and get legal status because they don't trust the government. So IRCA said, come to MacArthur Park, which has historically been an important physical space in the city of Los Angeles where many immigrant rights rallies and gatherings have happened. And they were going to do an information session on IRCA. And so that Sunday, my family, all of us went to MacArthur Park. I vividly remember the park was completely full. There was tons of people there. And here they were telling people, this is it. This is what, where you can go for help if you need help with the paperwork. And that's what finally convinced my parents that we were going to go through with it. And we finally filled out the paperwork. Now, by that time, I was in high school. I was doing very well. I did very well in school. I was a good student. But I had no idea how I was going to get to college. I had no idea whether that was going to be a possibility because, didn't have legal status. All of that changed when we finally got, our temporary and then ultimately our permanent legal residence. When that happened, things took on a whole different quality educationally. So I was always a good student, did very well. But with legal status came access to lots more resources, particularly to academic outreach programs, and particularly academic outreach programs that are federally funded, that have been pivotal in providing access to higher education for immigrant and low-income ethnic minority youth. So, in a different version of this presentation, I talk about how I'm a product of TRIO programs. TRIO is a group of federally funded programs that are intended to ensure undergraduate and graduate school access. And so in high school, once I got legal status, I was eligible for Upward Bound. And Upward Bound introduced me to my tutor, who was a college student at Pomona College, who senior year insisted that I apply to Pomona College and would not relent until I applied to Pomona College. I thought I was just going to go to a local, public university, and that's what I knew. I didn't know anything about, elite private liberal arts schools or anything like that. When I was at Pomona, I was able to be, because I had legal residence, was able to be part of the McNair Scholars Program, which is a program that is intended to create a pipeline to the professoriate into the doctorate and for low-income, first-generation ethnic minority youth. If I was undocumented, and the reality has been that over the years, I've seen many undocumented students that I think they would be perfect for TRIO programs, but they can't access those. So I share that information to give you a little bit of insight as to why I think it's so important now that I'm an academic to be able to contribute to our national dialogue about what we need to do to support immigrant and undocumented families. I share those details as well because although my experience was over 30 years ago, it's still the same for many, many families and individuals. 10 million, this is a very general estimate of undocumented individuals. Within that, over 3 million children and young adults under the age of 24. About half of those are in K-12, and half of those are in some version of higher education or the low-wage sector. So my story is not a unique story. In fact, is a common story. And it's a common story that over 3 decades later is still, very much part of the immigrant experience for Latino immigrants here in the United States. And now, it's interesting how we came from Central America when there was armed conflict, and now we have the unaccompanied minors coming from Central America, again, escaping, very harsh and difficult circumstances. So part of what I try to highlight when I talk about, undocumented students, so just education and immigration in general, is that, we tend to think about immigration as a binary issue, that you're either documented or undocumented. And that once you make that transition to being documented, in all the different versions of being documented, that's pretty much it, and you're done, and everything is safe, right? But the reality is that that's not what happens, right? Just because you get DACA, and so for those of you who don't know, DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is a federal policy signed by President Obama in 2012 that allows certain undocumented young adults who grew up in the U.S., who have been here at least 5 years, to get temporary legal residence. And so basically that protects them also from deportation, but also allows them to get a temporary work permit, a social security number. And so it's great in that it allows undocumented youth to do a lot of things they couldn't do before DACA. But on the other hand, it's temporary, and you can lose it. Our immigration laws are so strict that any minor, infraction of the law can disqualify you permanently. So there are many youth, and I keep hearing sort of even more cases, as I sort of talk to folks. There are many youth who got DACA who have now lost it. Right? So DACA is not permanent, and you can lose it, even of the minor with a minor infraction. Like if you get too many speeding tickets or traffic violations, DUIs, you're done. Right? So once it expires, that's it. You're now deportable. Right? If immigration comes across you, they'll deport you. And even those that have permanent legal residence, they're held to the same strict standard, that if you have any minor infraction of the law, you become deportable, right? They don't always necessarily come and look for you and knock down the door or trick you into opening the door. I mean, that does happen a lot, but it means you become deportable, right? So that here you are in a circumstance where you think, okay, everything is great now, I'm not deportable, but the reality is that there's an alarmingly high number of legal permanent residents that are not able to renew or who are deported because of the strict immigration laws that we have. There's also the other tragedy of youth that would have qualified for DACA but didn't because they were deported. And so just this last year, I spent a good part of the year doing a research study on youth who grew up in the U.S., whose dominant language is now English, who have an American identity and sensibilities, but they're on the other side of the border because they were either deported or they were forced to return because family members got deported. Now this includes children of undocumented parents who are U.S. citizens who are now forced to go to Mexico. They're immigrants technically in Mexico and are in a school system that doesn't support them, and is struggling to educate them because they're English dominant, right? And there's no capacity in the Mexican schools to provide an education or to provide language support for these Spanish language learners who are technically Mexican by virtue of their parents' birth, but they're also technically U.S. citizens, and the United States is doing nothing to protect their interests now that they're in Mexico, right? So all of this is related, right? And so when I insist on the importance of focusing on higher education access for immigrant youth, I don't just mean undocumented students. I mean U.S.-born children of undocumented parents. I mean all of those folks that live in what we know as mixed status families. And mixed status families are those where at least one individual in the family doesn't have legal status. And so it takes one person to not have legal status for all these concerns about deportations to impact the entire family, regardless of whether you're documented or undocumented, right? And the research literature is very clear that when you live in those types of households, anxiety levels are up and depression levels are up, right? That there's high elevated levels of those two psychological experiences as a result of having to worry about someone in your nuclear family being deported. So how many people are we talking about? So the best estimate that we have is that there are 14.5 million individuals in the United States today that live in mixed status families. So out of these, about 4.5 million are U.S.-born citizen children, and the other million are children who themselves are undocumented. So this may be kids who came to the U.S. when they were, a few months old to preschool age. But the vast majority of immigrant youth in mixed status households are U.S.-born children. Okay. Also, in the last decade, there's been at least 500,000 children and young adults who have been deported to Mexico, and U.S.-born citizen children. The best estimate is there's about 300,000 U.S.-born citizen children of deported parents enrolled in Mexican schools. And as you can imagine, they're struggling. Academic failure is rampant because there is indifference on the part of the Mexican educational system, just in the same ways that there is indifference towards the educational needs of immigrant kids in the educational system here in the U.S. So on both sides of the border, these are, families that are marginalized, right? That, experience extreme hardship in their children in terms of accessing education. Now, in the U.S., DACA was signed into law on a symbolic date. It was exactly 30 years after the Supreme Court ruling known as Plyler-Doe that to this day guarantees educational access for children of undocumented parents and undocumented children in the United States. So public schools cannot deny children an education based on their immigration status. Now, the way that we came by this law is that in 1975, several school districts in the state of Texas decided, we're not going to educate these undocumented children or the children of these undocumented parents. So they started to try to put policies in place to exclude them. And one of the things that they try to do is to charge them a fee for their public education, right? And so, of course, MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and other civil rights organizations began to work together to challenge these school district policies in the courts. So there were several going at one point, and they were eventually consolidated into a single case that 7 years later, from the first school district in the Houston area, try to make undocumented students pay for school, that it made its way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled on a 5-4 majority that in fact it's unconstitutional to deny children a public education. That the court reasoned, we don't know whether at some future time these undocumented children will gain legal status. By excluding them from a public education, we are creating a permanent disability in terms of their ability to contribute to American society in a way that an education allows you to do, right? And so that is the law of the land that continues to this day. And so President Obama, I think, as someone in his staff is a student of history, and so they decided to sign this DACA into law on the 30-year anniversary of Plight-Lerdo. So we think that about 1.7 million, almost just shy of 2 million young people are eligible for DACA. Now again, here's another policy that we think, okay, great, this is going to help a lot of people, right? Almost 2 million that can benefit. But up until now, the number of young people that have been able to benefit from DACA is about 500,000. So you're looking at about a third of potentially eligible individuals. Now that's not taking into account now, 4 years later, many individuals that have not been able to renew DACA because it's so expensive. I mean, it is such a financial hardship. I remember in my family, there was 4 of us, and to save up the money to submit the application and pay the application fees, I mean, we had to borrow from everybody. Now imagine having to do that every 2 years. It's virtually impossible. So what happens in that case is you're not able to put the money together, you're not able to submit the renewal paperwork. Guess what? You're out of status. Now you're deportable again, right? So even though, ideally this is a policy that, can potentially help a lot of individuals, because of the logistics and because of the cost and all the hardship that goes with it, only a third have been able to benefit. And there's still a very large percentage of folks that haven't applied for DACA because for the same reason that my family took so long to apply for IRCA. They just don't trust the government, especially in light of the fact that, we are living in a time in U.S. history where we have had the highest number of deportations in the entire history of this country. In fact, in the last 15 years, we have deported more people than the previous 100 years. Okay? So whereas in 1892, we would deport 1 person for every 250 people that were admitted to the U.S., now we're deporting 1 person for every 3 people that come into the U.S. I mean, the change in the rate of deportations in the last 10 years is staggering. So the likelihood of someone in your family or someone that's a family friend being deported is extremely high. So the need even to benefit from even these temporary measures is absolutely critical. So out of these 1.2 people that have not applied, there are also individuals that are precluded for a variety of reasons, and a lot of that has to do with their age, right? DACA has a limit that you have to be 30 years of age or younger, right? So all of this means that the instability of immigration status, the lack of pathways to legal status, complicates access, and it complicates youth's ability. And so depending on where you are on these different types of immigration statuses, it either means you face more obstacles or less obstacles. And so if you have DACA, or you are documented, meaning that you have legal permanent residence, then that means access to this type of resources. But if you're undocumented, or if you live in a mixed status family, then it's a whole variety of challenges. Now, one important obstacle for children in mixed status families is that, even for those that are U.S. citizens, as they're filling out financial aid forms in the FAFSA, FAFSA requires your parents' social security number. Undocumented parents don't have that. So that means that even U.S.-born children of undocumented parents can't fill out the FAFSA and can't get the funds that they need because of their parents' undocumented status. I mean, that is a very, very significant obstacle for children of undocumented parents. Now, to highlight that in another way that I think will hopefully help you to understand just the magnitude of this issue of the lack of legal status on educational access. So, we've calculated that any given year we have 123,000 high school undocumented students. Now, out of those, only about 65,000 graduate every year. And out of that 65,000, less than half of those are going to actually be able to set foot on an institution of higher education. And out of all of those, out of this 31,000, less than 2,000 will actually end up getting a college degree. Now, you don't have to be a math genius to calculate what percentage this is of this number, right? I mean, this is what we're facing, right? And so the students that we see in higher education that are undocumented, basically what this figure says that if you're undocumented and you want to access higher education in the United States today, you have to be phenomenal. You have to be the most resilient. And you have to be lucky, right? You have to have things lined up just right and have, interaction or the opportunity to have a mentor or someone that will guide you and direct you where you need to go. It's like a gauntlet. But that means that chance or circumstance is what's driving access for this select few, as opposed to systematic policies to facilitate that access. So the DREAM Act, which sort of the term dreamer comes from the federal DREAM Act, which is legislation that would provide a path to legalization for undocumented students who grow up in the U.S. And the criteria is generally that they've been in the U.S. at least 5 years old, at least 5 years that they came to the U.S. before the age of 15. That's pretty much what's typical of all the different versions. And then there's versions that say you have to be a high school graduate, others that say you have to be enrolled in college. But the DREAM Act, has never been passed into law. It was introduced in 2001. We came really, really close to passing into law in 2010. It passed in the House, but fell 5 votes short in the Senate. And so, but what the DREAM Act has done is it has spurred a series of state policies. So rather than wait for the federal government to, sort of settle this issue, states have taken it upon themselves, given sort of the confines of, of what states can do around this issue. And so you see here the states that are sort of this pink. Those are states that have state policies that provide educational access by providing in-state resident tuition as opposed to out-of-state or international student fees, which is the case in the states that don't have it. Those are these blue states, including where we are today. And then there are these purple states which provide in-state tuition, but they don't provide tuition assistance. So in California, recently we passed what we call the California DREAM Act, which in addition to allowing undocumented students who graduate from a California high school to pay in-state tuition rates in the public university system, they are also eligible for the state's financial assistance program known as Cal Grant. And so you see that, there's a good number of these states, the purple states and the pink states, and there are some states that the system of higher education, so in Michigan, for example, the Michigan university system provides some sort of support for undocumented students, but it's not a statewide policy. It's a system policy, right? And there are states that actually have laws in place in the Southeast that prevent undocumented students from enrolling or that ban their enrollment. So DACA has done a lot of things for the fortunate few, the 1/3 of the potentially eligible folks to be qualified. We certainly have seen improvement in higher education access. Students can now do internships because they now have a work permit. In many states, students can now get driver's licenses, which was a big limitation before. They can get bank accounts. They can have access to health care in some states. But the challenge is that it's temporary, and there's still a lot of things that are in play in terms of the mixed status issue, right? So it doesn't matter if you have DACA or if you have legal status, if your family gets deported, because that means more likely than not you have to go back to Mexico, regardless of how you're doing, regardless of what benefits you may have with DACA. That may all disappear from one day to the next, right? And this is the issue why currently there is a big press for lobbying for what is known as DAPA. So last year, President Obama tried to extend the DACA policy to include temporary relief for the parents of the U.S.-born citizen children, the 4.5 million that I mentioned to you, and for the 500,000 number of DACA recipients. And he also tried to expand DACA so that he tried to do away with the age cutoff of 30 years old, because there's a huge group that is excluded because they've aged out, because they've been waiting for so long, right? I mean, they thought the DREAM Act was going to pass in 2001. You know, now they're early 30-something-year-olds, and they just missed DACA, or they missed DACA by a few years. So President Obama tried to address that. That was challenged in the courts. It's made its way up through the federal court system. And this summer, it will be heard by the Supreme Court. Things have now gotten a little hazy, you know, with the passing of Justice Scalia. So, you know, there's a lot of movement right now to try to lobby for the passage of DAPA, because that would then remove this barrier for those that live in mixed status families, or for many, not for all, but particularly for those that are U.S.-born children, or those that have already benefited from DACA. And that potentially also could create an incentive for those that are eligible for DACA that have not benefited to get DACA, so that their parents then become eligible for DAPA if it were to become a policy, right? So that's the new frontier, that's the new challenge. But in the meantime, just because students have increasing access doesn't mean that, you know, everything is peachy and, you know, they have no obstacles, or, you know, minimal obstacles that they face. The challenges remain in that many of them, you know, see, this recent study by my colleagues at UCLA, in this study that they call the Undocumented Scholars Project, this is nationally representative survey of undocumented students in colleges and universities in the U.S., they find that 72% work, and they work very long hours. And so you can imagine it's really hard to do your best in your courses when you're having to work. And not surprisingly, 74%, you know, face a variety of financial challenges. Over 2/3 are the first in their families to be attending college, and for those of you who know the challenges of first-generation students, that's another layer on top of the immigration issue. But the important finding here as well is that we have seen over the years, to go along with the state policies that open up access, an increasing number of colleges and universities that are creating, in the same way that we've created affinity centers for Asian American, for Latino, African American, and LGBT students, they are creating spaces known as dream centers, and they function in the same way that these, you know, multicultural centers function for diverse students, right? And it's a place that provides resources that are particular to their needs. In the same way that we see many colleges and universities, for example, I'm seeing a trend of this growth of first-generation centers. So, you know, actual places that are specifically tailored to the needs of students that are the first in their family to go to college. And so 73% of these respondents said that this was an important resource to have available and that they actually benefited from it. But, you know, one of the things that came up 10 years ago when I started doing this work, and this is why this is so alarming, is that despite all these policies that we have in place, despite the growing number of dream centers, that still, just as it was the case over 10 years ago when we did the first, you know, large survey on this, students continue to worry about finances. it continues to be one of the most important roadblocks. So you see here this percentage of 57% reporting that they're worried about college, and 74% saying that they left school because of finances. Now, for youth from low-income backgrounds that have legal status, what we have in place for the financial needs of low-income students in higher education is we have the federal loan program and the grant program, right? The federal Pell Grant. And so I want to sort of point your attention to this here, that for low-income students like the undocumented students, 63% of their costs is covered by these Pell Grants. Undocumented students don't have access to that, right? At these two-year institutions, it covers a huge percentage of their cost. Now, this is important because the majority of undocumented students in higher education today in the U.S. are at the community college level, right? So the fact that they don't have access to this leads to these rates of leaving school because of finances or worrying about finances. Now, in that respect, and I expressed to Lucas, sort of my being particularly pleased to be invited to speak on Marquette, is that Jesuit colleges and universities have stepped up to that in some way. So, today, undocumented students who are accepted into Ivy Leagues or the most selective liberal arts colleges and universities in this country, all of those institutions now provide full funding for undocumented students that meet the admissions criteria, right? In the same way that they provide full funding for any low-income student whose family makes less than $100,000, right? Well, all that started to happen after a Jesuit institution decided that despite whatever concern there was about public backlash in providing scholarship to undocumented students, decided to create a scholarship fund specifically for undocumented students. And so in 2005, Santa Clara University in California created this endowment of about $1.2 million, which is still considered the largest endowment that's specifically dedicated to undocumented student scholarships, where they provide full funding for 4 incoming freshmen and a transfer student from a community college. Now, soon after, so this was before the Ivies had, this program, and before these highly selective schools had this program. But they were the trailblazer, right? They were the ones that said, because of the social justice portion of our mission, this is something that we need to do. And so they created this fund where, the staff themselves, from their salary, contributed to this fund. In the same way that Loyola University of Chicago, most recently, the students have decided to follow the same example. So last year, the student the student government voted to increase their tuition by $2.50 per student to create this scholarship fund that has been ratified by the Board of Trustees just last month to provide access. Loyola University of Chicago is also among the first universities to admit and actively recruit undocumented students to its medical school. Okay, and the St. Peter's University in New Jersey, it's one of the 28 Jesuit schools, colleges and universities in the United States. St. Peter's University in 2014 did a big blitz and press release about the opening of a Dreamer Center on campus to support undocumented students that are enrolled on campus. Fairfield University did this national study of undocumented students at Jesuit institutions. They received $200,000 from the Ford Foundation to study access to higher education for undocumented students, and that was led by faculty at Fairfield University, which is another Jesuit institution. Loyola Marymount University, similar to Santa Clara, also has a big scholarship program for undocumented students where they pay full tuition cost. So, I think there's, these are institutions that, have sort of not succumbed to sort of all these concerns with a lot of institutions that continue to be, some of them provide these things, but very low key. They don't want any PR. They don't do press releases. They keep their fingers crossed and nobody finds out. These are folks that, are leading by example. So to kind of wrap things up and take some questions, I just want to share with you what we're doing in California. And these are things that, are all, all of these examples, or most of these, are things that initially started as institutional policies. And eventually politicians saw the benefit of that and decided to scale it up to a state policy. Right. So in terms of the state policy, when Janet Napolitano became the president of the University of California system, she created an endowment to open dream centers at all of the system campuses. And these centers eventually then created this feedback mechanism, and so the Dream Center initiative was followed by a student legal services center. And this is important because a national study that was just conducted by Tom Wong, a political science professor at University of California, San Diego, who also, like myself, was undocumented when he first came to the United States. They found, and sort of working with grassroots organizations that provide legal services to immigrant communities, they found about a third of undocumented students were actually eligible for legal status, but they didn't know it because immigration law is so complicated, right, and so nuanced. And so they come in trying to get help for DACA, and the lawyers are working, or the law school students are looking at it, and they realize, actually, no, you can skip DACA and go straight into temporary permanent legal residence, and then ultimately naturalized citizenship. So there's a great need to provide sort of legal support, because there are many people out there of this 10 million that, if this nationally representative sample is correct, then that means out of these 10 million undocumented individuals, there could be up to 3 million who are eligible to apply for legal status under the various options that we have, but they don't even know it because they don't have access to legal advice. The other thing that's happening is the federal government bureaucracy and processing immigration paperwork is horrible. There's delays, and so one of the ways in which students have been falling out of status and losing their work permit and having to stop their work is because they submit the paperwork in time for renewal, but the agency doesn't renew them fast enough. And so then students all of a sudden have a job, and then they have to stop working because their work permit expires because they haven't received it yet because the federal government is behind. It used to be 3 months. Now I think it's up to 6 months behind schedule. And so one of the things that the University of California system started to do was to provide a grace period for students who are still waiting for their paperwork to come in. The UC system is very active in advocating for DACA and DAPA. They're working with the White House Initiative for Educational Excellence. In terms of state legislation, and again, with the exception of the professional license bill, we passed an in-state tuition bill. We passed tuition assistance bill. One of the things that started to come up once we were successful in opening up the pipeline is that now students want to go into professions where you need a professional license that is issued by the state government. So if you want to be a psychologist, you want to be a teacher, you want to be a doctor, you want to be a lawyer, you need to get licenses by the state. Prior to the passage of this law, you couldn't do that. So you could go through a teacher education program or a counseling training program, but you couldn't become a counselor and you couldn't become a teacher. We did away with that 2 years ago with the passage of this SB 1159. And one of the most recent accomplishments in California is the passage of this tuition loan program. And so the state has created a loan program. So since students are not eligible for federal loans, we have created a state loan program where students borrow money from the state at the same rate of the federal loans so that they can pay for their higher education costs. Currently, this is legislation that is in committee and making its way through the legislature. There's legislation to pass dream centers in the other public university systems in California. So in California, we have 3 systems. We have the University of California system, which is a 9-campus system. We have the California State University system, which is 21 or 22. I always forget the number. And there's a community college system, which is, you know, over 100 community colleges across the state. And so this legislation would provide resources to all these institutions to create a space in the same way that we have, you know, multicultural centers at many colleges and universities. This SB 247 would extend that to high school campuses so that high school students who are undocumented can start to learn about the options available to undocumented students before they graduate, before they get, you know, they start to figure out higher education. But as soon as they start high school, this is a place where they can get support. And the other, the most recent proposed legislation is to provide a state-funded work-study program. So again, we have, you know, for low-income students, we have federal work-study that's available. California is going to address that for undocumented students by providing a state-funded work-study. Now, the work-study, the Dream Center, the tuition loan programs, these are things that actually existed in various institutions prior to the legislation, right? So, and that's particularly something that is an option for private colleges and universities to create these kinds of programs. So these are things that, you know, the politicians themselves didn't invent them. They just saw an idea and they said, oh, hey, I could upscale that and, you know, and get some kudos along the way. So, so that's something that, you know, I think is very important for others around the country to kind of learn about what's happening in California so that perhaps, you know, that could be a starting point for figuring out, you know, how things can be done locally. And so the reality is that looking into the future about why we need to keep DACA until we can get permanent legislation, why we need to expand to DACA, and why we ultimately need to, you know, work towards, you know, permanent solution to the plight of undocumented families, is that without that, so what I try to characterize here is just the likelihood of going into, you know, sort of the living wage workforce if you're undocumented or you're someone from a mixed status family. So this includes U.S. citizen children who, you know, at any point, so this is the U.S. educational system, this is the Mexican educational system, so this is just focusing on Mexican origin individuals, that at any point, you know, they can enter elementary school and they get bumped to elementary school in Mexico because their parents get deported. Or this could happen in high school, they can get bumped to Mexico. Or once in high school, they can get bumped to Mexico. And for the most part, for those that get bumped to Mexico, it's the low-wage workforce. Access to higher education in Mexico as Mexican nationals for deported youth is actually harder than it is for undocumented students here in the U.S., just to give you a sense of just the challenge for those individuals. I mean, and that's not even taking into account the linguistic and cultural challenges of readjusting to American society. But in the U.S., even for those that are not deported, the likelihood is that after high school, most of them, the only option is the low-wage workforce. And for the few that are able to go into higher education, most of them are not able to finish, so they also end up on the low-wage workforce. And these are the less than 2,000 that you saw in that figure. That's the very tiny group of folks that are actually able to get there. And I think that's such a tragedy, and I hope that what I've done today is to highlight, I think, the importance of continuing the work, increasing our efforts, and finding ways to get politicians to do the right thing. So I'll end there, and we'll open up for some questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
You mentioned the programs that have passed in California. Obviously, we don't expect you to be an expert in Wisconsin law, but do you know of any similarities here? We're very different demographic.
I don't know of similarities here. I know the challenge here is a lot higher than in California. I mean, in many ways, Wisconsin is sort of heading towards where California was in the late 1990s, where we had a governor that had a very anti-immigrant stance and, in fact, championed a series of policies that were intended to, Prop 187 is one that comes to mind, where it actually tried to, keep undocumented children from going to school. That was quickly tossed out by the courts because of the Plyler Doe that said you can't do that. And so some of the things that Governor Walker has said, that's gone on record of, not supporting this kind of things, even if there was some way for that to make its way through the legislature, the governor, I think, would be a significant hurdle in something becoming state policy. So I think, in the same way that this is happening in California, I think part of the work or part of the answer to sort of how do we do something like what's happening in California is that until there's a change in the climate in state government, but these are things that institutions themselves and private institutions obviously have a lot more flexibility. I mean, the public university system here, I think, is much more constrained in being able to implement those things. But I think, the public universities, like Marquette, a lot of these things, if there's will on the part of, the leadership and the administration, it's not rocket science. I mean, it's very doable, and there are already existing models in place. So as I think about, okay, what's the lesson here for Wisconsin? I think that's the lesson, at least now, given the current political climate. Yeah.
So, obviously, I don't know what you know about Milwaukee, but there's 3 different, I would say, educational systems. You have the charter system, you have the public system, and the private system that is funded all by government.
Yeah.
What would you say, or what would be, from your research, what could we do in the education system that are dealing with K-12 students that are coming from these homes in order to be able to provide and assist with some of the stress levels and things of that nature? How do we educate them or provide support for parents and support our teachers that may not be prepared or exposed to dealing with students from these backgrounds?
Yeah. I think there's more flexibility in terms of what charter schools and private schools can do. I've actually have been invited to speak to, the National Association of Independent and Private Schools, and so it's this national organization that includes, all of these different, private schools across the U.S. And they're very much interested in this. And this was actually quite a few years ago. I mean, it's not a new thing. This was back in 2012 when, they invited me to their national conference, and, we did a big, presentation around this. I've been invited by charter school systems in California who they want to be able to provide access to students. So, and part of what triggered that, invitation was that, they had these really, stellar students, outstanding, right? And so, not knowing about the fact that they were undocumented and the students, it's very difficult to, share that information with anybody, even, a trusted educator. It's not something that comes by easily. That all of a sudden, they're having their best students not continue on to college, and it's not until they do investigate and realize, oh, it's because they're undocumented and they don't know about what's available for them. So part of what the conversations that I've had with them is to educate them about what is available and to help them figure out how they can institutionalize support to provide that information and to provide just even the kind of hand-holding that a lot of students need to be able to put together compelling college applications. And I think the important thing, the reality is for undocumented students, some of the best options are in sort of this private college and university system, and especially those that are highly selective, have stepped up and provide full funding. And so knowing about those resources, sensitizing teachers and faculty. There's There's, I think, the best known and the largest undocumented student organization in the United States, United We Dream. They do a lot of this training and preparation. I mean, and they continue to expand, and they have a campaign which is, I believe, is on March 10th. They have this National Teacher Coming Out Day, and so they, on social media, they have high school teachers of all types of high schools, public, charter, private, holding up signs saying, I'm an educator and I stand with undocumented students, or something to that effect. And that's a way to just sort of publicly articulate and make sort of this topic something that people engage with and want to learn more about and be prepared and be informed about. So there's a lot of that work that a lot of grassroots, even a lot of college student groups at colleges, sort of dreamer clubs. One of the most significant things that they do, so they do activism, and most of them, when most of us hear about them, it's because of their activism. But the other thing that we don't hear about, which is actually the bulk of what they do, is they do teacher training. They'll do events like at this space. Like, I've been to a couple where it's a whole room just like this, filled with high school teachers, counselors, administrators from the surrounding communities and high schools that they invite to train them. It's like a free professional development, and to sort of help them figure out how they can be allies and advocates for undocumented students. And I mean, it's sort of this important critical work that they're doing that it for the most part goes unnoticed. But for those of us who study this issue, we know that those efforts on the part of the select few that have been able to access higher education, they're going back and giving back. And this is one of the important ways in which they do that. So part of it is, United We Dream. If you go to their website, they have all kinds of resources, and I believe they even have a thing where you can fill out if you want them to come and do a thing at your school. They have allied training, and so once you go through that, then you can get like a sticker that says that you're an ally, and so that's an indicator for undocumented students. You put that on your office door or in your classroom. Teachers know then, this is someone that I can trust with my background and the obstacles that I face. And that's a very common thing that, just is increasingly becoming important in states like Wisconsin and other states in the Midwest and the Southeast where, even though the population is growing, the infrastructure is not what it is in places like California, for example. Yeah.
So you talk about like the state's legislation that has like undocumented students and like DACA, many of the programs that are being placed. I just want to ask, like, what's your outlook in like legislation that would lead to like citizenship? Yeah.
So I've talked to a couple of legal scholars. I mean, I'm not a legal scholar, but I'm a student of sort of the legal history. And the sentiment with legal scholars is that documented youth are going to be the first wave of folks that when we actually do have a system in place to provide a path to legalization, it's going to start with the documented and the documented if we can put that in place. There's precedent for that. Over a decade ago, we had there was an immigration category called TPS, Temporary Protected Status, which is kind of like DACA, but it was specific to Central American migrants. Basically, international courts found that the policy that the U.S. government had towards my family and all of us who were fleeing, armed conflict in Central America was a violation of international conventions and treaties, and that in fact the U.S. was obligated to provide refugee or political asylum status to those Central American immigrants. Well, as part of the settlement, Congress passed TPS to provide this temporary protective status. Basically, they got a work permit and they got temporary legal residence. but it was kind of this limbo thing that, you know, it could go away at any minute. Eventually, they realized that we just can't have this whole category of temporary things that people had always being in limbo. So eventually, Congress passed a law to allow those folks to get on a path to legal status, and so many of them then went through the process and became from TPS to temporary legal status to permanent legal residence, and many of them are now becoming eligible for the naturalized citizenship. So the sentiment is that when we actually do get things in place, that the first group of individuals that will be able to benefit from that are going to be the folks that are documented now. And if DAPA gets upheld in the Supreme Court in the summer, then those folks would also be the next in line to be eligible. That's sort of the outlook in terms of who would be the first beneficiaries of some kind of law that would provide a path to legalization. Yeah.
So you mentioned that in a lot of the movements and a lot of the programs, initiatives that have been established, they started kind of at a grassroots level with task forces. How were they able to do that? How were they successful? Do we have a sense of how they were successful as opposed to other groups and task forces that weren't able to kind of establish that?
Yeah, well, I mean, generally, and this has always been part of the history, is when there's a task force that ultimately results in some significant institutional change. I mean, the students are sort of the leaders. So the usual. So if I could paint for you sort of a typical process to go from task force to having a dream center on campus, it starts with students themselves, you know, and the undocumented student group on campus, who then reach out to their allies. So the folks that have, you know, demonstrated that they're committed to supporting them in all kinds of ways by being creative and helping them access institutional resources. So then they bring in those people, and so that's the initial, you know, that's the first version. That's the 1.0 version of the task force, right? And then eventually they realize, well, you know, we got to get, you know, more influential people that actually can, you know, champion institutional policy changes at the higher levels, right? So then you start to bring in people from, you know, from student life and academic affairs. You start bringing people from the provost office, sort of VPs, and ultimately, and so then that group starts to then focus in on particular initiatives. But always, I think, you know, what's always important in that process is that the students are always driving it, because, you know, oftentimes some of the things that I've seen is the staff and administrators, their interest will wane. You know, they're always busy and things are happening, and so there's a tendency of like, well, you know, we're going to get to it, but and the students are saying, well, no, we don't have that luxury. Like, you know, I may have benefited from some of these things, but there are more that are waiting, and there are more that we could bring in if we put this in place sooner rather than later. So that sense of urgency, the sense of we can't, you know, pause, or we can't, you know, we have to take advantage of momentum. We have to keep the momentum. We have to increase the momentum. I mean, that's what student voice is so important in the task force process. And eventually then that becomes something that results in a concrete, specific, or a set of institutional policies like book loan programs, or, you know, provision of legal services by collaborating with local lawyers, the immigration lawyers that provide pro bono services. A lot of the things that we saw here, they started like that. These very small, you know, magnitude kinds of efforts that eventually, you know, now we have state laws across the state of California that impact, you know, dozens and dozens of students. And so that's what typically the process looks like. The engine that it continues it, and despite, you know, perhaps, you know, some waxing and waning of interest and commitment on the part of staff and administrators, you know, it's the student, I think, presence and leadership and guidance that I think is a key glue to the whole thing.
Are there other practices, best practices, to address climate towards, or the climate basically for recruitment and retention of undocumented students do you see the development of the Dream Center as kind of the epicenter for a changing climate, or are there other practices that we should be aware of?
You know, now that dream centers, I think, are becoming more prominent and prevalent, they tend to be sort of the place where a lot of these institutional initiatives or ongoing creation of institutional initiatives began, but not necessarily. So, you know, one of the things that I've seen in terms of efforts to change institutional climate is to do a series of workshops, teach-ins, you know, sort of informational, you know, sort of types of sessions to just break down, not only to provide information about resources, but just to address the misconceptions that people have about this issue, which are very, very, you know, I think rampant. I mean, just to give you an example, even this still happens today in California. But this was an issue that came up in the work of Francis Contreras, who was a professor at the University of Washington, and who was very pivotal in that state's in-state tuition policies. That even though it became state law, they were doing sort of this data collection in campuses across the state, and they found this extreme resistance on the part of the staff to apply the law because they had a political difference with the law. So they disagreed. They didn't think that undocumented students should be able to access the same services and supports that, you know, in-state resident students were getting. And so they refused to follow the law. And so, you know, so she writes about this, and, you know, so this is something that, you know, comes up in California. Even though you think, okay, California is sort of, you know, where everybody's on the same page, not necessarily. There's a lot of resistance, and a lot of that resistance is based on misinformation, misconceptions. You know, those things are so rampant, and so part of all of this, the teach-ins and the workshops and the, you know, the information sessions addresses all of that, so that ultimately, you know, that starts to change the climate, not just with the staff, but even with the administration, who then, you know, they're the ones that really can allocate resources to sort of scale it up from an initial group of, you know, folks that are already, you know, kind of already friendly to the issue and already supportive and perhaps may consider themselves allies. You know, you don't want to, you know, there's not a lot of benefit to just preaching to the choir. You gotta, you know, you gotta reach out to everyone that may have preconceived notions that are not based on evidence about undocumented students. Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, you know, my colleagues at UCLA, this UndocuScholars project, if you're interested in that, you can Google it. Their effort is precisely to highlight the heterogeneity of the undocumented student population. You know, the reality is, you know, at the end of the day, the largest proportion by far are, you know, immigrant youth from Latin America, particularly from Mexico. Mexico by far has the largest, you know, group of undocumented youth and families. But there are also a significant number of undocumented students from South Korea, from the Philippines, from Taiwan, from Africa. There's a pretty sizable population of undocumented Polish and Irish immigrants. So it was interesting, you know, being in Chicago a few years ago when I was talking about this issue, where folks started to say, "Oh yeah, you know, there's a Polish enclave in Chicago, and there's, you know, and so people they say, well, you know, there's a large undocumented immigrant population. In Boston, there's a large Irish immigrant population that is undocumented, and so there, I mean, they live, you know, in enclaves and families that, you know, and the thing with them is, they don't look undocumented because people associate undocumented with sort of the stereotype of, you know, that you're brown and you're from Mexico. So this UndocuScholars project actually has data on other national origin groups that also, are impacted by the issue of undocumented status. And actually, if you're interested in that, there's a documentary called "The Dream Is Now." You can find it on YouTube. It's directed by Davis Guggenheim, who some of you might recognize that name. He won the Oscar for the documentary "Inconvenient Truth" about climate change. He did this 25-minute documentary. I show it in my class all the time, and he profiles several undocumented students who come from different national origin backgrounds to show that this is not just a Hispanic Latino issue, but that in fact it impacts other communities. So if you want to see it, check it out. Get some Kleenex because it's a real tearjerker. I mean, it's very powerful in that way. But the documentary, it's an activist documentary. It's sort of the message at the end is we got to do something, and these youth can't wait any longer. So if you want to check that out, check out David Guggenheim's "The Dream Is Now."
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.